on the Lorig doing that same da same Jones namja shebe kablaya same joint delia mopju ngajis shene da dinane ngaz tamade da rasa shengyur shi se de kasa ni da gyoba da doba da joba shi bo de shengyur shi che ane di kabrelia ane gewa da kabrel mi gewa kabrelia na luma den mo gywa yores de inza da shengyur shi re se ne di ko rasa de ne shi shero da.
Good morning. Last night then, within the context of awareness and knowers, we looked at the final twofold division. We completed the final twofold division, that into main mind and mental factors. And amongst the 6 divisions or 6 groupings of consciousnesses that are mental factors, we looked at the final grouping, the 4 changeable mental factors. And these were sleep, regret, investigation, and analysis. And as we saw last night, that these are changeable because they can be virtuous or non-virtuous or neutral.
Lorig Session, Geshe Thubten
Within the context of this topic, awareness and knowers, we've seen that there are many different ways that consciousness can be divided. And within the varying divisions, one comes to see which types of consciousnesses are beneficial and which are not. Within the presentation on mental factors, here we saw that all the suffering that we experience comes from the 2 groupings of the root afflictions and the secondary afflictions. Not only does all the suffering that beings experience come from these 2, but it's the afflictions that keep us bound within the suffering realms of samsara. All the harm that we experience, or the suffering we experience, the harm that we bring to others, this is motivated or comes from the afflictions. So merely stating that our suffering comes from the root and secondary afflictions is insufficient. We need to come to recognize this as being correct. Because in general, in the world, in society, the source of suffering being internal, being mistaken ways of thinking, is not accepted. Generally, the source of suffering is pointed to being something outside of the individual that is suffering, either other people or events. Whereas here, it is shown that the source of suffering is within each of us, these afflicted minds. And it's important to recognize this, because suffering is unwanted. It's this that we want to be freed of. To be freed of the result that is suffering, one needs to identify the cause that leads to suffering. And that cause is internal, these particular consciousnesses. It's not something outside of us, either individuals or circumstances.
다 저기 가라하고 그래서네 다 누가디 요바 동아 세대 가지고 요바다 하고도 벤 류리아 차베 동아다 아니 나비 동아다 아니 데니기 동아 요바데 가지고 하고 두보로와 진짜 동아다 하고 고래 진짜 니 규디 가르르스네 레테 군동 가소레 zanyududa ni nyushule tinde jungwa yimbadi gyudi hagu go manga hagu tugo marwa jesa dunga gi dunga nawa da chaba da deni gi dunga de ba hagu tugo arte ina di tsawi gyudi da tsawi gyudi karela na zanyudu li go de le tinde yonggo ba de nga hagu tugo mare chene.
Suffering being what we all want to be freed of, when one looks at suffering, there are differing ways to divide it. But among the varying ways to divide, the one that we are most familiar with is the suffering of physical and mental pain, suffering such as illness or from excessive cold or excessive heat. When we experience suffering like this, we readily recognize that we are now experiencing suffering, and this is a result, and it comes from a cause. But that cause, though, we don't readily identify as being a root affliction. So therefore, even with the most apparent suffering, we don't recognize that its cause is internal. It is a root affliction.
남시기 장모시 디진 용거 진짜 디 동안 용거마다 뜻자위 요 잔연되게 차사 말와서 비게 당한서 삼로 날라디 용거로 받아.
So certainly in the world, this would be seen as surprising to say that the cause of our physical mental suffering is internal, is an afflicted mind. Because, for example, if one is experiencing indigestion or food poisoning, one would say, I'm ill because of something I ate. Or if one is suffering due to the weather, it's too hot or it's too cold, one will point to the weather as being the source of our suffering, not an afflicted mind.
동해 규 차와 두지 동해 숨용거 제자디 동해다 하고 그러마도 규에 동하다 차와 두지 동해서 하고 그거 말에 엔데스게 균용 뭐바디게 하고 그거 말 디가르진 하고 그거 말은 럽고 말바데 럽든 지해요 말바데 지상하는 주다 낭비기 철에 대바지 철에 냠는 지해 주이나 야지경한 주게 최고 럽정 제대 갑라 내 대송한 동아래 규에 동아 차바도 동아래 대소규 안에 녀모발레는 용고레세드마 송고르마도 지용을 양아주기 지소나리아 안 동아용다 디솔디고 시고 말 그래서 칼라마스베 사타마리베도 동아리기레 안에 가서레 아지기 루제하고 마존나 안에 나zel리기레서 온두스티네 용다 시기로마도 데니기 그래서 디 동아다 규에 동아다 차바 두지기 동아다 하고 그거 말에 디하 먹어야자 디기 랍해요 말에 데네레스 디 랍해메도 디기 규디가림 하고 두고 말아 진짜 다 먹어야지 롭종 제게 매와 자는 지소나리아 디도 롭종 지금 매와 다 먹어로 와 디 롭종 맞는데 가린 하고 해요 말아들어.
I mentioned then a moment ago that the suffering we want to be freed from, that can be understood through varying ways of looking at it. So the most common way to divide suffering, to come to understand it, is into three: the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering. Of these three, generally in the world, people only know the first of those three divisions, the suffering of physical and mental pain. The other two aren't even recognized because they are unknown. Similarly, the cause of these three, including the suffering of these three divisions of suffering, including that of physical mental pain, the cause as being the afflicted minds, this is also not known in the world. And the reason for these two, the differing ways, a broader way to understand suffering, as well as its actual causes, the reason that this is unknown in society is because it's not taught, it's not presented. And if people never hear this, never come to study it, it will remain unknown. And it can probably be said, though, that amongst the various presentations of suffering in the world and its causes, it's only that within Buddhist philosophy that looks at suffering in this way, in terms of the divisions of suffering and its causes. So, for example, if one experiences physical pain or illness, then society will guide one in terms of what one's diet should be and whether one is doing sufficient exercise, living a healthy lifestyle, in other words. So this is what is understood in society, but there's no understanding that's deeper than that yet, an understanding that actually the root cause is our way of thinking, in particular these afflicted minds, the root and secondary afflicted minds.
Dine zada nga zuki dunga side karaji jungor sina nga zuki yonsa shi dunga yonsa yuzo di tendi nga zuki suki pungpo de leti garwa. Chesa nga zuki suki pungpo di yoba inza andelia ane chi namshi changma chayadu nga zuki ya dunga chabe dunga leya da cawa chimbo de cawe dunga leya da andelia chike shenda semjenda de chike sora kyabana cawe dunga leya da 칼라로 제도다 디나를 맞춰봐 수부들을 맞춰봐 차야지 나용하다 차야지 또 나의 동의 용하게 쪼어디 다 유의 동의 용하게 유된 쪼어지 가르쳐 아주 수기 풍부디 지고래 내려야 캬바두지 동아래 예서다 제가 아주게 동의 용하다 아니 개인디에서야 동에다 개인산달리고티나 쪼어디 풍부될 때네 디 땡지고래 진짜 동아다 유의 동아야 차상이 땡 쪼어디 아주 풍부될 때리고래 제가 디 풍부디 아주기 야고 매바 따래 제자디 고규도 가서 캬바두지 동아라고 제자 딩안주 동아이 바디 하고 두고 말해 규의 동아된 아주 동아이 하고 두고 말해 아주 공부에 때에 캬바두지 동아이 바디 가서 하고 두고 말해 제자디 하고 와 제고래 신고고래 제르다.
The reason that this is a deeper way to understand suffering, as well as the causes of suffering, is unknown in general in the world, is because the basis of suffering, our physical and mental aggregates, these remain unknown in the world. People generally don't have knowledge of the physical and mental aggregates. In dependence on having, we experience suffering. It's because we have these physical and mental aggregates that we experience all three types of suffering. Because we have these physical and mental aggregates, we experience physical and mental pain. We experience the suffering of transient happiness. We experience all-pervasive suffering. So without recognizing the basis of independence upon which we experience those three types of suffering, we will not identify either the three types of suffering and certainly not its causes. So it's not understanding our aggregates that means we do not understand suffering and its causes.
탕보다 야고시우에나 델레데네 내나서 뇽뇽 가시 수부 교다 되나 데zel레데 내나서 망알래야 돼 저기 통치수기바 차되로 제자디네 인상 아주 풍부 될라야 다 몰람당 개와 바실레데네 주비고 풍부시 임바이나 아니 아주리아 제 수부 델레데네 데네가 강한 나제 요야요 말에 용고요 말에 제자당 아주기 풍부데 가르레 몰람당 개와 바실레데네 주비바 임바나 풍부데 몰람나 개월에든 주고 풍부 자주 선배주 파바다 상예 파베주 구 풍부디게 몰람나 개월 진짜냐 줘봐 다 되네 이나 풍부 있나 될 때네 나자 요요 말에 제가 동아도 규에 동아요 말 요요 말 그래서네 네 풍부디 잡아주지 동안 책요 말에 자좀 받듯이 땅 아주 이 풍부디 잡아주지 동안자 될 때요 제가 아주 가르고 그랬으네다 아주 풍부 야부식 네 나자 모양이 풍부 되네 약보시 와야 돼 가지고 탑시 제고 걸어 왔다 가지고 거야 되고 그래.
So So generally, we can say in general in the world that someone whose physical body is in good health, they're going to experience less illness, and those whose body is weak and frail are more likely to be susceptible to illness. So we can say that, and that is correct. But there are beings who have accumulated huge stores of specific types of virtue, as well as these being combined with specific prayers, who have a physical aggregate that is completely different from what we have. And these beings would be Arya Bodhisattvas and Arhats. And they experience no suffering at all, not just freedom from physical and mental suffering, but also transient happiness and all-pervasive suffering. They've achieved aggregates that have transcended suffering. They do not have the basis upon which suffering can be experienced.
Dunga sheparcha se dunga de ha go go kyo dangbo kyo dunga de ha go ba che shos che dunga sheparcha song le che da dunga sheparcha de dunga de ha go de da dunga de gyu de kar le chung re sin gyu de ba che tang go re che san gyu se di kun ju de ba se cha go re che san di bang go re se kun ju bang wa cha se kun ju bang go re che san di bang ba ne da dunga di kun ju gyu de bang sha ba na dunga gi phung bo dunga ya ma re che san Deva charugo, Deva ne Deva mato dunga yo mares. Da yudi ganes pangbege, ganes yudi pangbe pangbase gokten se chiore, diba ngaz kula kieba chehore, di kieba ina dunga pangrugo re chere, kasa kunju se panggo re, chesa pangbe gokten se ngaz togo re. Di raya la karje gore se lam nyamlen je gore, lam gombale den togo mato shanda toya tapshi yo mar. Chesa lam nyamlen cheba ina jedu dunga gokten se ngaz kula leong res. Gokten leodu ane kunju de pangores kunju pang de gudi meba sa de ma ba na dunga yo mares jeza dangbo san yemnen de gi shi so ware jeza dunga she par cha kunju pang war cha ane ngo bong de she lam gom bar che sa ondu sung ko la lam gom bar che dunga ka she bar che sa kunju pang war che sa go bong ondu che lam gom bar cha sung ro.
And it's therefore that the very first teaching that Buddha Shakyamuni gave in this world, at Varanasi, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, he taught that suffering needs to be known. Beings need to understand what is meant by suffering, not just in a very coarse level, but on a fine level. So the first teaching then was on true sufferings. Suffering needs to be known. But merely knowing what is meant by suffering or pain or misery is insufficient. One has to understand the causes that lead to suffering. So these causes then need to be abandoned. And these causes, the true origins, are the origins of suffering. So this was the second key point. Then thirdly, through abandoning the causes, the origins of suffering, one attains a state freed of suffering, a state of lasting happiness. Due to there being no presence at all or arisal at all of suffering, one's happiness is lasting and stable. Here, one has achieved true cessation, and what has ceased? Suffering has completely ceased. This was the third teaching, true cessations which need to be actualized. And then fourthly, Buddha Shakyamuni taught at Varanasi, the method, the technique to achieve cessation of suffering, to eliminate suffering completely. And these are are true paths, or the mental paths that one needs to cultivate within oneself in order to achieve liberation from suffering, freedom from the afflicted minds. And the true paths, these are to be cultivated. So therefore the Buddha taught that through cultivating true paths, one will be able to attain true cessations. And true cessations, and achieving a true cessation means that the origins of suffering are eliminated, and if the origins of suffering, the causes of suffering, are eliminated, one will not experience any suffering. Therefore, one has attained liberation or freedom. So this was the first teaching the Buddha gave on the Four Noble Truths, teaching the truths of suffering, of origin, of cessation, and of paths.
수볼야 캬비 동아 레요도 아주 하고 두고 그래 장모 차대 장비 동아 레바 아주 하고 수볼에 칼라 마세게 나요도 아주 하고 그래 지산디 하고요도 하고 한디 체마디다 셰바치어로 와다 다베네 차도 베 장모 동아 차기도 선비게 하고 한 셰바치어로 와디 루시게 루기 셰바 르 가스페데 가지고 디시 원병어선 셰연도 갑라 가서 그래 루기 원병어선 체마 셰거디 아주라 초와 동아중에 요 동아 하고 행기 체마디 가르쳐서 원숨이 체마디 원 루기 원병어선 체마서 지금 저 로리 돈나라 셰다 원숨이 체마라데 원배 원수지 이용어선 체마 원병어선 체마데라야 나는 아주게 나체도 루기 원병어선 제상 아주 하고 해도 루기 원병어선 체마 하고 거디 아주게 요래 가서 하고 거디
When Buddha Shakyamuni taught first that suffering needs to be known, then he would first have explained illustrations of suffering that are easy to understand, such as when we are cold, this comes from the climate, or when we're feeling ill, this may have come from something that we've eaten. And then how do we come to know this? How do we come to recognize that we are suffering, either, say, from the weather or from what we've eaten? Well, we have a consciousness. It's through consciousness that we recognize our suffering. And in this instance, it's a sense direct valid cognizer relating to our body, or a physical direct valid cognizer relating to our body. That recognizes that we are feeling ill. So therefore, he presented this link between consciousness and the recognition of our suffering.
Esa denigi chabe dunga nyondu kabla di kapso danga juki sem chikin bor chabe rja nyondu ke hako hangi da chago sum hage sheba chili ro denigi sem chili ro di kholo kunro nga yo chowa dushi semba yila cheba raba senga le yo jezong kunro nga di nyomde le go di na de nga juki shukche di nibe shukche di chowa di le go de 초와디게 장외 라제 뇽요디 안 두시디기 오당아 차기도 세베데 차기도 선바하고 두고 그래. 제가 디네자 델야 땅 아주 로릭 나라 시에디 장외 라제 딩아 주기 하고디 갑라 시에바 가르 로릭 dwi나네 가르리기리 랍나 체마디 원병 오스미 체마세 원병 오스미 체마레 다디 콜야 군조 알리기리 원병 군조가 초와 두시 선바 일라시바 락바 아요레 세지 두소 디네게 하고 두고 다양한 저기 로릭 자비게다 개변로이디 차고로 와다.
Let's say one is cold, then knowing that one is cold, being aware that one is cold, is dependent on consciousness. So it's consciousness that recognizes that the body is cold. So taking then the presentation on Lorig, we can understand this in differing ways, because Lorig, awareness and knowers, showed different ways that consciousness can be divided and thereby understood. So if we take firstly the most recent division that we looked at, main minds and mental factors, there will be a main mind, and thus will be surrounded by a number of mental factors, including the 5 omnipresent mental factors of feeling, discrimination, intention, mental engagement, and contact. So amongst these 5, which are always present, when we are cold, then it's the feeling, mental factor of feeling, that is particularly dominant, and hence we are very aware that we are cold. Or if we take another presentation of awareness and knowers, then being aware that we are cold, if we look at it from the 7-fold division of awareness and knowers, In particular, to sense direct valid cognizer, that is recognizing that we are now experiencing cold. So that was something that we looked at nearer at the beginning of this text. So therefore, one can use these differing divisions to understand our own psychology, to come to know ourselves better.
And then that child that children ma nimal ma doenje da nga chagu tsana jige chalo dawe na da nima doen na da children doen de den ma ji de jige drege rakjale de den ma zhang yu rakja de ma nu bu chung da de den nga zu lu liya jige an zhe ting ting an ji chowa dewa ji de lang la li gu wa di dewa di yu du ma se de da 지금 안은 뮤라 디 대화해서 대화시고 다가 최날 빼지나 셔도 유유 동화스 민다고 할때야 템부요 말디 대화데 템부요 말 유루 그래서 템부요 말해서 디 다디 내가 대화를 해 유르지네 제래 동화를 내용 그래서 지금 미디 인자 되는 게 대화들이야 안 유유 동화시고
Now, when we're feeling a little cold, then we'll do something to warm up. So perhaps it's a sunny day, one goes and sits outside and enjoys some sunshine and starts to warm up. So here we'll have the mental factor of contact, which is coming into contact now with the sun rays, and one is warming up. And the feeling then starts to become quite dominant, and this is a feeling of happiness or of joy, because now one is experiencing warmth. The suffering has passed, and now one is experiencing happiness. But from the Buddhist perspective, this feeling of happiness is actually called suffering, in particular, the suffering of transient happiness. And this is the second of the three types of suffering. First, the cold that was being experienced is the suffering of physical and mental pain. Now when we're experiencing happiness of being warm, this is called the suffering of transient happiness, because this happiness isn't lasting, it isn't stable, it will end.
대신에야 어디시우 차소선 비 잼비 쟁거로 와데 대시 니말 직도에 말레가라야 마시우 차소선 비 잼바치요 제사디 젠시세들야 가성한 주진안에 가소레 지시에서나 지고 무슨 제바 지시에서 저 지시에서 차고를 젠시에 그래 지시에 그러 지나다 되네게 죄질레진다 죄팅팅레제 양가삼 질야 차차네 차유도 마시 망고실리로 대지데 대신에야 지칠론 되게 니면 되게갈 기고 쉬우셔서 자스비 대나라 중소선비 전시셔로 디안 전시의 지시세들이 제가 온두신에 아주리고 되네 질려도 다도 전 삼다도 가sam질량 저게 대신예래 되네게 장화를 하자레스 된 니말마 되도 이디 대나라 리스트 이나 다양 차차제 차유 동안리도 전에 되네 섬도 대신 가랑라 대랑라 레디 초와티 지선 대화에 이나 템포리면도 아디 규루도 지선 되네 규 템포리면도 지선 되네 시드다 규 동안세 되네 레도와 선비게 당아제 대신예래 되네 레서 다디 되네 샤송 선비게 제바 지거로와 제바제 삼노 땅거로와 제바제제 되네 초와 대화디 되네게 초와 대화디 규루 지선 규 동안세 레샤 인사레다 베지나레 셰제바제 규 동안세 되네 시 레도와 선비 하고 요도 제바제 삼로타 제바진 하고에도 디 초와 동아 대화디 규에 동아 하고 그 체마디다 제바 체마자고 가지고 제 가소래 로리 균나셰도 제바 체마세데 하고 가디 가서 김센제 제바제 다시 제제 김센 삼다지다디 대시 초와 대화디다 규에 동아를 샤서 하고 간디 제바 체마서 자고 당은 로리 균나데 하고 간디 다 제바 체마자고 그래.
Sitting in the warming sun, feeling happy, we then can also recognize that whilst we're sitting in the sun and feeling happy, that a few moments before we were inside and cold, that is a memory that a few moments before we were cold. So in terms of the sevenfold division of awareness and knowers, that memory consciousness is a subsequent cognizer, because of having previously had a direct perception of being cold, we now have a memory consciousness, a subsequent cognizer that we were called previously. So that is another of the sevenfold division. Then furthermore, sitting there, using our Dharma knowledge, being mindful, being aware of this inner process, being aware of our psychology, we remind ourselves that this pleasure, this happiness that we are experiencing now, independence on being warm, this is actually suffering. It's a suffering of transient happiness. Being transient, it won't last. Therefore, it's impermanent. This is not the kind of happiness to strive for, to long for. This is happiness that is momentary. And we can investigate further, coming to see how we tend to be so motivated in so many of our activities to achieve happiness that doesn't last. And here, when we come to this clear understanding, based on reasoning, that this pleasure of being warm is the suffering of transient happiness. This is this consciousness that comes to that understanding, that comes to this realization, is a valid cognizer, in particular, an inferential valid cognizer, another of the sevenfold division of Lorig.
That the sheet Gabrielia, Duhan Yungudus, Gabrielia, and the Devar Yungudus. That in a day, the dos Kurichin, Dunga Cha Yungudus. Two Chisati, Garichin, Yungura, some say, Dangazuki Pumbo Delia. The Luki Pumbo Della Gunji, Chisan Della Dina, Pumbo Della Dina Dunga Leo, Pumbo Della Dene, Anjiki Dust, Devalia, how do you Dunga, Chisan Pumbo Coron, Suki Pumbo Coron, Gunji dos. Chisan Daddy. Delia, Dunga, Gu, Dunga, Niga, Gitinchi, she did on the Pumbo de League to us. Just on the Pumbo de Yabu Mebajata, Bitaru, Carasene, Gabriel Dunga, Dewachi, and the Gurja Dunga League to us. The Pumbo de Guinchi too, Sempe sometime Jabachigoroa. And Jabachin and Gazam Gilia, two Seneshida, that Pumbo said, that Gu Dunga, Casa, Chaba Duji Dunga said, then the inside some big that. Shunalaya, and then the Chawadu said, my motor cheshapa, Beji, some diada, and so you get someone like Jeva Cheche, and Jizan, Dambo Dunga, Dewali, Dunga, that Dewali, and Gur Dunga, do send it in Jizan Pumbo Dele Junior, that Pumbo de Chawadu Dunga said, then the Resha, that is then the Redoa, some big touch, Gumse, some touch, Badi, the Java Samacha. Jizan Saman, Mosum Samada, Jisupe Sama, said anybody, Manzula, the Bejutan de Cabla, Dambo, Dunga Hago, Mosum Sematic Hago, Delapa Jebachin, then Gu Dunga de Hago, Delapa Jebachin, Chawadu Dunga said Hago, Dinigi, Manzuki, Hago, Samadi, that Jinganzu Mosum Samada, Jeva Samati, Bejutan Ligorwa.
Furthermore, sitting in the warming sun, we can continue with our process of investigation, recognizing that this pleasure of being warm followed the suffering of being cold. So we recognize before we were physically suffering, but here we now go deeper, recognize that this happiness we're experiencing too is suffering, because this happiness is transient. Doesn't last, but serves to deceive us, thinking that this is something worthy of striving for. And the reason that we experience these two types of suffering, the suffering of physical mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness, is because we have the basis upon which we can experience these two types of suffering, their basis being our physical and mental aggregates. It's because we have aggregates which themselves are in the nature of suffering that we can experience, and we do experience, suffering. And this is where we come now to recognize all-pervasive suffering, the third type of suffering. All-pervasive suffering refers to merely possessing or having these physical and mental aggregates which came about in dependence on contaminated causes, and therefore the aggregates themselves are contaminated. and serve as the basis upon which suffering is experienced. So here now, we've come to investigate and reflect and realize the third type of suffering, all-pervasive suffering. Here we come to realize this too with an inferential valid cognizer. So in this way, we use analysis to investigate our mental process, to investigate suffering and happiness. And we've come to understand the three types of suffering. We came to understand it with a combination of both types of valid cognizers, direct perception and inferential valid cognizers. And therefore, we've also come to know some of the non-valid cognizers, such as subsequent cognition. So in these ways, we can use our understanding of Lorig to come to know ourselves better and to deepen our understanding of the Dharma.
Dine hago yodu da dunga shebacha se dunga da hago ware dunga ju dunga chawa du ju dunga se da hago wa da dunga shebacha se donda di da di anto dunga hago ware da dunga hago wa enza da anzo phungbo di da phungbo de le gyuen du se ben nga da jala nyo ru sin de gyuen ju na de ju ga de che ware sa ji dang go wa de di na sing anzo phungbo de da dunga chawa du dunga yin ba hago yodu 다디 교연시 다디 가르에서 규간을 누구도 쓰네 양아저기 야 제바체 고르와 제바치도 당은 제바체디 소수의 냠는 제변은 소수의 풍보때라 제바체디 야가샤고 소수의 풍보때라 제바마죠 현질의 제바체바는 디지기 고 아줄이야 냠뇽들이 두고 말이야 제자디네서 당보 소수의 풍보 당이 풍보디 간스케바레 시도 당아저기 당아줄 밀샤바네 가스케바레 라요디 나 당보 가와서 아미기 로난 뭐 된바리 세지 다들 마심 주신 리그로와 제가 아미 로나라 된 당보 가르쳐서 당보는 아미 로나라 도도 친구 여러분들 요 말에서 야야야야야 대용도 아니 가슴 찔이야 아니 나 수보 주다디 파미 쿠다니 제발에 된 중화디 델야 리규텔리그로와 다 파미 쿠다 두발네 제발 두바 중화디 가르치는 용어래 랍두 파마니디 펜춘 착섬께제 착섬께네 아니디 조어체 발에테네 쿠자 중화래 데네 뒤네 뒤세 데네 고가도 수부 차도해와 제사다 제상 안주기 당보 거 수부 차에기 유자와디 파미 쿠자이디 차요래 니니 요야 유조어디 파마니 펜춘 착섬께베 착섬될 얘기 제상 착섬데 뒤에 차차되어 제사 데네상 안주 풍부 주의 유조 당보디 데네 되셔라 되는 리그도 와서지 다 녀모 말때 되네 주도 와서 제바제제 노스 제바제 오거와 다가지 군주시야 고주고 되네 다도 슬레다 다 군주기 친구스 라요 말이다.
What has just then briefly been presented ties back to the first teaching that Buddha Shakyamuni gave. At Varanasi, we are taught that suffering needs to be known. So here we looked at suffering, the three types of suffering, and we've come to understand them a little better. But that is insufficient merely to understand what is meant by suffering. We've recognized that our aggregates are in the nature of suffering and therefore are an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. But this needs to be understood well. It is insufficient merely to accept what has been told to us. And the reason that is insufficient is because that will not lead to a transformation of our way of thinking and thereby our behavior. We have to analyze, we have to investigate. So it's been said that our physical mental aggregates are in the nature of suffering, an illustration of all-pervasive suffering. So this needs to be investigated to see that it is true. And the basis of our investigation, or what we investigate, should be our own aggregates, not those of someone else, but our own aggregates. Because this is the basis upon which we experience suffering. So let's start then with our form aggregate, our body. So this form aggregate, it's a result, it came about in dependence on causes. So we know quite readily that we came from being born from our mothers, We also know quite readily that we didn't just magically appear in our mother's womb, but our father's sperm fertilized our mother's egg, and that was the physical process that led to our birth, and in fact, the mere fertilizing of the egg, that was the attainment of our form aggregate in this life. But there was a cause preceding that too, and that was the consciousnesses of our parents. So they would have had attachment, and due to attachment, they would have slept together, and we would have been conceived. So therefore, when we look at the stream of causes that have led to our attainment of this particular physical aggregate, we look at the obvious physical causes, but we include the causes of our parents' consciousnesses, in particular, their minds of attachment.
Denegi duba dele namshi number sheba de shuku namshi shuku kurwa cheza namshi shuku je bardo aseji ma chine den ma namshi shu cheza namshi dinala namshi shuba de garjin yungure labna deya yudan ki mebale den yungumba yudan ki la den yungore cheza di gewang ameki ande je ke seba da lemba da siba se denegi silin seba ane je ke on desole den yungore da seba da lemba se de döcha de cheza Oh, yeah. That they cannot that thing. Oh, just and 저기 남시 슈에디 규디 가르쳐서 녀리아 세바 시바 나 세바데 렘바 세디 세바 렘바 시바 데솔레tin 용고래 니 세바다 렘바 니보데 되샤래 돼요. 세바데 렘바 니데 되샤래 돼요. 파미 쿠자 듀바들 남시 슈고로와 남시 슈에디 규단 낀 매발레티네 연구 말에 규단 낀레티네 연구레스 규단 낀 가르티네 연구레스네 세바다 렘바다 시바 데솔레티네 연구레스 바르도키 시메당이 세바다 렘바다 연구레스 제자당은 저 개왕아미게 세바다 렘바시고로와 데네 시바 줍 데네 바르도 줍 데네 밀기고로와 제자 데네데 연구거래 제자다 세바다 렘바세디 되샤레 돼요 레제레
For us to have taken this rebirth, the mere fertilization of our mother's egg is insufficient for one to take a rebirth. Consciousness needs to enter into the fertilized egg. So where does that consciousness come from? So it's not going to come from our parents because it's not their consciousness. The consciousness will come from the intermediate state, the state between that beings pass through, coming to a new life, and even prior to that, there is a ripening at the time of death in the previous life of mental factors of craving and grasping, and then with the third following from that of existence or becoming, the being moves from the previous life into the intermediate state. So of these three, craving, grasping, and existence, these first two, craving and grasping, are attachment. So here we see the role that attachment plays. Previously we saw in the role that attachment plays in one's parents, but now also for oneself, moving from the previous life through into the intermediate state. Attachment in the form of craving and grasping also plays a crucial role.
아니 디양 다 데니기 세바데 렘바티기 되차차되레 데시 파마니 아니 펜진 차과게 차과데 되샤레 Deso, Tanga, Pumbo to you. Kunju Dempa, said you Kunju Dempa, that they didn't loading not share do, and they got or Zanyu Drugnane, Desha said Chegoro, Chesa, Mazuki, Dunga, you saw the Zanyu Drugnane, Nane Desha said Chegore, Chesan Deso, Deshare, Zanyu Drugnane, Desha. Then I together, Tenshi, Dembashi, Nemja share the Kabla, you Kunju Dempa said, Dunga, Gasa. You don't know to see you could this all mean Kunju Tempa Lagore, Mazoloric Nala share do, then you do Nane and the Jasha said Chagore.
And from this presentation on the Four Noble Truths, this is the second, that of true origins, the origins of suffering, the origin that leads to us continuing to have these contaminated aggregates. We see how this ties in with Lorig, as well as the general presentation of Lamrim. So from our parents, they are motivated with attachment. From ourselves, or the being that is to take rebirth in a new form, in a new body, they too have attachment, specifically in the form of craving and grasping. So therefore, all three parties, mother, father, and the being coming into, the being that will be the newborn, have attachment playing a key role. And then, so this then is the presentation in the Four Noble Truths of true origins. And we look at it from what we looked at now recently in Lorig. This attachment is a root affliction. We saw it on a preceding page. Within the 6 root afflictions, there is attachment. So therefore, this root affliction plays a central role in the attainment of, or the perpetuation of contaminated aggregates.
Yesa denigi juda seba de lemba diki ya ane da jugarelitne ligors ne zawi nga ju nga sebe nga rashin tuba nga rashin tuba zimba zawi da se marikba delatne ligore yesa de nga ti tambo nga sebe nga rashin tuba zimba ke an digi ne lesa de legi basha sha an di chele selen seba du sin ligore yesa da dine ya ju tu de Zawi Zawa de la Gude, Zawi Gude Karchawas and Dine, Nga Seba Nga Rashin Tuba, Nga Lemie, Gudan Jen Kalama, Rango when you droop to Gengi, Nga de Nangore, Nawa Nashi, Takada Yore, Simbi Zimbashi Yore. Then Diniki Zimba Della Dene, Nga the less Ayada, Dene Seba Seba Lemba Lea, Dinma Jewa Lead, Chazan Dus Levare, Chesa Dene Zam, Dene Nga Rashin Tuba Zimbadi, Lorik Dunan, the Sebana, Marik Pasa Chagor, Zawi Zanyu Duinane, Marik Pasa Chagore, Marik Pare. That Chesna Denga Zugi, Dembashina, she do Kunju Tempa, that's all the Chagore. Chesna di, do Sine, do Cheba Che, Danga Zugi Pumbo di Juhadi, Ya, sometimes dinner in the Jungudua, Chesa, Duesha, Marik Zawi, Marik Paki, di Wangeda, Duesha, the Lesa, Legi, Wangeda, do Chene Seba, the Lemba Saki. Dene Sibasiki, do Chenea, and Pamigi, Kuta Duyon de Dele, Namshet in the Shugdua, some how going on do, De Kunju de Beju, Manzo Dunga, Pumpu, you Kunju about how go order, Manzo Kunju how go order. De how go on, Lodi down do Jebache do some down the Jebache, Gimza, some how go do, De how go and Samadi, Jebatamasa Chagor. Then I Jeba do Susu, Yongda, Jeba Muchin, some not river, some Jebache do Chin how go, how go do. Di how go when the Dunga Timpeke, Pumbo, Juzo, the Disoreshas, how go do, Kunju Tempa, the how go are, Di how go and Samadi, Jabba Samasa, Chagor, Lorik Dunane. Tisan Seba, the Lemba Juma, the Karishan Ligo Resene. Then I to get Tambo Zawi, Jula, Nga Siba, Nga Rashin Trubas, doesn't tell it in the orders. It's not deep Tommy Maribas and Anzu, so Zawa Disha, the other said. Tommy Maris and Dambo, Maribas or Shebadida, Anzu Maribati. Jeza Delatine. Yeah.
So here we see the role that attachment plays, a central role that attachment plays in the process of taking rebirth after rebirth after rebirth. But attachment itself is a result in that it has its own cause. So attachment, whether in the form of attachment that we have at the time of death, which is divided into craving and grasping, or attachment in general, it comes from or has a preceding cause of ignorance, in particular the ignorance of self-grasping. The ignorance of self-grasping, which we saw amongst the root afflictions, this is the very root of all suffering. This one ignorance, the ignorance of self-grasping, is the very root. Because from this, from grasping at the self as existing in a way that it does not, all other afflictions come and the accumulation of contaminated karma. This is the root cause of all suffering. And then at the time of death, this too plays a role. From grasping at the self, of this ignorance of self-grasping, grasping at the self as existing in a way that it does not, comes attachment, in particular, here, attachment in the form of craving and grasping. And this then leads to rebirth, being propelled through the bardo and into a new life, or into a new body rather. So this is how we can come to understand true origins, the second noble truth, in more detail, the role here that ignorance plays. So in the previous segments, I emphasized the role attachment plays. Here I'm adding that attachment comes from ignorance, in particular the ignorance of self-grasping. And whilst in terms of the Lorig presentation, the mental factors presentation, attachment is also a root affliction like ignorance is. Ignorance is actually maybe you could say the fundamental root affliction, because it's from ignorance, as we said last night, comes attachment and anger, and from these come the other root afflictions and then the secondary afflictions. So this is, again, how we use our understanding gained here in Lorig to understand the other presentations of the Dharma in more detail. And here, when one reflects on this repeatedly over a sustained period, using investigation and analysis, coming to understand this deeper, one comes to gain an inferential valid cognizer, realizing independence on reasons, realizing directly the process of true origins. And then the last point to make, this ignorance is the ignorance of self-grasping. In this context, it can be called beginningless ignorance.
다 군주 된바 하고야도 당아주 가르 삼땅고래는 지사다 다세 마리바디다 고빵 투구뒤에 투구민도 세야 제바제야 되고 제바제 지도 다음에 봐라 제바제 리고래 지사다 다세 마리바디라 나아주 다 세야디 나 세바 나진들라 나 가니스 난구들랍도 나 세야디 다동아주 삼단에 아주 소스라 나 세야디 나 대여 삼다이도 풍부하다 나 수기 풍부하다 샘노도 가야 마인바 나 코롱 나 지기 여바루지 가서로 내가 철거래 지사 데니게 나와디 라신 주바 나수디 차르 가래 마도 호롱원이 주바 여바 난고로 디나와 나신 여바 짐바디다 다시 마리 바스 차고래 지사 당한도 될야 데니게 낭축이 로딜야 당어 디가르 난구도 선배데 낭수디 야부 하고 같이 하고 차외 제일야 다나 나와 나신지 다 가와도 생각도 풍부에 때는데 누구의 면도 안데 풍부에 때는 낭 수기 풍부에 때는 매나 낭 삼로 셈이 되다 가와도 제바치도 되네 간sam질이야 안데 가야 고 유단 긴 만저그 풍부하다 맞대봐 그런 원이 줍대와 자와기니 민도 선배게 다 동비 동사지 통고로 봐 하고 용을 해제 이 제바지 김제 먹고 삼다도 되네 하고 용도 동반이야 하고 말했어 지상 동반이 하고도 니 하고 당보 하고 채마디다 제바채마서 동반이 또배 제바채마시고 봐.
When one reflects repeatedly on true origins, understanding the origin of our suffering, naturally, when we recognize in a transformative manner that it's the ignorance of self-grasping from which all suffering follows, naturally the thought will come, I need to abandon this. How can I abandon this? And to do so, to abandon ignorance, one needs to cultivate a contrary mind of wisdom. And there are many types of ignorance, and correspondingly, there are many types of wisdom. The particular ignorance that's the root of all suffering is the ignorance of self-grasping. The contrary wisdom is the wisdom realizing emptiness. So here, in dependence on recognizing the role that ignorance plays, the ignorance of self-grasping plays, and our resulting wish to abandon this, one will engage in the meditation on selflessness or emptiness. And this starts with first coming to get a sense of how our self-identity appears to us. So we're all sitting here. We all have a feeling of self, a self sitting, a self that is listening, a self that is thinking about what is being said. So we have this sense of self. So the first step is then to see, how does the sense of self appear to our mind? How does it naturally, spontaneously appear to our mind? When we've got a feeling for or an understanding of how the self appears to our mind, we then need to see if it exists in the way that it appears. Because we've heard about the ignorance of self-grasping, and this is an ignorance that grasps at our sense of self-identity as existing in the way that it appears. So when we get a feeling for how it appears, we can understand that our ignorance grasps at that, believes that this is how it exists, and this has been identified as the root cause of all suffering. So now we need to look for this ignorance of self-grasping. We need to look for this sense of self. Does it exist now in the way that it appears? And the way that it appears is as if it's independent and unchanging. So we look for this. We look in here. We don't look away from ourselves. We look here with our aggregates. We look first in our body, and thereafter we look in our mind. And we've now, through the study of this text, we've seen the many ways to divide the mind, and we look in all of these, or many of these, coming to see whether the self exists in the way that it appears or not. And through going through this process repeatedly, we will repeatedly come to see, or come to understand, that we cannot find the self that exists in the way that it appears, not in our body, or any individual one of our consciousnesses, or even their collection. And as we engage in this meditation repeatedly, based on reasoning, going to subtler and subtler levels, eventually we'll come to realize that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And this is a cultivation of wisdom, realizing emptiness. And when, through repeated reflection based on ever more profound reasoning, we come to realize this will be realized through a consciousness that is an inferential valid cognizer. So amongst the sevenfold division of awareness, this is the second, the inferential valid cognizer, realizing the emptiness of realizing emptiness.
대시 마 사랑이 주바 나와나진 짐바디다 오 록셰레샤 다디 론도주 록셰세레샤 제자다 디빵 투야두 디빵 베 빵바세디 빵 투야두 제자 빵베 곡딘 토야두 세야데 곡딘 투기 여바드 하고 걸 탈바 투기 여바드 신나 하고 살아 다 탈바 투기 여바 하고 완자 다 탈바이 토베 돈달이야 다 람디 똥바니 또베 샤랍 곰구두 제자 다 코와딜라 타야 탑슈두 제자 다 코와딜라 타에게 탑름두 제자 타구두 셈베 셈슈디 다 가슨 코와레 타사 여바데 하고요디 코와레 타르두게 삼바 뱀마스 슈치무기 되고와 제자 데네자 타야게 돈달라다 가르고공스네 코와레 타야 탑슈두 제자 타구두다 타르투서레 셈베 타구두 셈베 삼르게네 데네 다메부터 베샤라 고미야다 아니 디가라 로바 마주게 Jampa 수를 쇠발라 소버 준비 아니 딩에진 아니 지간서 다 다음에부터 셰랍티야 또 봐서 마연 바고 니거서 신의 줍지 실라 신의 줍 신의 용어 줍지 실라 손조금 조고도 선배 삼당에도 되네고 제가 저기 람냠렌 제 다음에 봐또 봐다는 지소 파진 주기 진소 주기 냠렌 제도 고조 용거래
to the extent that one engages in this meditation and comes to an ever profounder realization of emptiness, one will recognize that this wisdom that realizes emptiness is in accordance with reality, and therefore the ignorance of self-grasping is a wrong consciousness. It's not in accordance with reality, and moreover, it can be abandoned. And we know that it can be abandoned because we are coming to understand reality. We're cultivating wisdom, and thereby we know we can abandon ignorance. And that means we know liberation is possible. Cessation of suffering is possible. And that's the third noble truth, true cessations. So it's not that we've achieved a cessation, but we know that cessation of suffering is possible because we've recognized the origin of suffering, and we've understood through our meditation on wisdom that it's a wrong consciousness and can be abandoned. So having gone through this process of first reflecting on suffering, thereafter its origin, and thereafter cultivating wisdom and coming to see that cessation is possible, this adds great strength of mind. Strength of mind in terms of a determination to cultivate the mental paths, the fourth noble truth, true paths. To cultivate these because it's these that are the method to achieve cessation of suffering. And amongst the true paths, one will be particularly inspired to cultivate the wisdom realizing emptiness, because this is the direct antidote to the source of all suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping. But one will also know that merely meditating on selflessness is insufficient. One needs a strength of mind that comes with having attained the union of calm abiding and meditative insight. It's only with such a strength of mind that one's wisdom can be of sufficient strength to eradicate ignorance. But in order to cultivate the union of calm abiding and meditative insight and have the strength of mind for one's realization of emptiness to be powerful, one needs the assistance, the support of other meditations developing virtuous minds, such as generosity, ethical restraint in particular, patience, joyous perseverance. So here then, through having come to understand that cessation is possible, strength of mind is attained, and one readily applies oneself to the path, cultivating all 6 trainings of generosity right the way through to wisdom.
제가 데니게 람 냠len 치디 갑라 당한 주고 거에 로릭 나라 셰드 냠len 제야데다 개와 죽지 세야데 개와 죽지 냠len 제야데 안디나래 아마저기 유명한 아세티게 아우줄이야 냠len 치디 걸로 디술리고 유명하지고 그래 개와 죽지데 냠len 제고 거와 제데 유명한 아티게 레용 거 당한 로릭 뒤나네 셰여도 아마저 개와 죽지 세야다 유명한 아세티게 아우줄이야도 냠len 제비 갑라 디수베제 다야데다.
And to express the attainment or the cultivation of mental paths slightly differently, to express it in accordance with what we've been studying in Lorig, when one has gained the determination or has come to understand that cessation really is possible, one's going to strive to cultivate paths. What are those paths? The 5 object ascertaining mental factors, which are pervaded by being virtuous, as well as the virtuous mental factors. So therefore, another way to express the cultivation of the path to freedom will be to cultivate the virtuous mental factors and the object ascertaining mental factors.
나디네 자당한주 냠len 치디 갑라 당보 대시 제반 둥하디게 하고 와체 다 대시 삼다마나 신체 둥하디도 삼다 데네 둥하이 규디 안에 가르갈리우스는 주군조 템바데 리뷰바데 하고 와체 데네 군주세디 빵 투구도 민도코세자 바체데 다음에 받을 삼다제 디바도 냠레 제디 나 냠레 제발라 디숨디 냠레 제고바드 마제바 조스 냠레 제요 말다가 디숨 인지미 제고 다 디숨 제제 다음에다 탈바서 토액이 두 사고데 다 람무스 냠레 제베 갑라 디네 군로리아 소소라랑 지부기 된데 탈바 토비 칠도 삼다바인데 냔디게 람다라게 람차르 냠레 차르 고래 다 데니게 빠야 동화 탐질 저투야도 지자 군주 빵 투고도 지자 랑지부 마이 샘전 탐지기 빵 고도 샘전 탐제 델라 타고도 샘전 탐지기 된다 삼다와이나 데네 냠네 람데 냠네지도 잡아치미 주게 람 냠네지 자고 그래 다 대화 침비 취 냠는지데 차요도 차도 갑라 다 심지어 탐제 동아탈 조고 될레다 될레람 교화 등어도 도 장발을 냠는 제대로바이나 다 토비아 상요고보 토일라 다른부 책도 될레데네 지금 아게 돈에 냠는 제대 텔레 교화 토구스 비기 뉴와 토구스 배 삼다데 지도 대가게 냠는 돈 이거 제가 되네서 다 냠는 가래 제베나 당보 군주 동아시하고 그래 디니 군주 하고 그래 디니 군주가 뽕 토구 위에다 매대 탈바 토구 위에다 하고 그래 니 하고요도 데네 신에다 아주게 람 냠는 제라 군노 전주 심주 군데 나바이네 태바침에 취냠는 제 차로 심제 탐지기도 차바나 태바침에 취냠는 자고래 다 심제 탐지기도 제 투사 말에 소소 라나 직부 내갑다 탈바 토구스 배 삼다지 냠는 람 냠는 제바이나 다 년도람다 랑게람 냠는 자로 제가 디니 냠는 제다 디래 제가다 디니기 냠는 제다디다 람림 나로 손데 림바 손데 다가래 도다 상지 다송 가호송부이네 냠내제 다가레마도 아니 조상 다가라 차고 왔다고 곧 되네기다 람 냠는 제비 갑라 대 제부 중요 람지리만 냠는 제다 징게 냠는 제다 제부 쳔비 제부 쳔바다 도당 아게 아니 캬브라 토네 람 냠는 제다 두시 캬브라 두스티는 군노 토네 외용으로 있으셔서
I want to present this again because it's really imperative that one gets the sequence clear for oneself. So when the Buddha gave his first teaching, he taught that suffering needs to be known. I referred earlier to the 3 types of suffering, and we need to come to understand what these are and see how they pervade our existence, how they pervade every samsaric being's existence. And independent on the clarity with which we understand how we suffer, not just the coarser levels, but the subtler and very subtle levels too, we will then want to understand the causes. And if we've understood suffering in both a coarse and subtle level, we'll want to understand not just the coarse causes of suffering, but also the subtler causes of suffering. So therefore, true origins, the causes of suffering, the origins of suffering, need to be known, and then they need to be abandoned. And here one needs to gain experience that abandonment of the causes of suffering is possible. So here one will reflect on emptiness. One will cultivate a wisdom that understands reality. And it's through engaging in this that one will see that cessation is possible, that an end to suffering is possible. And to the extent that one gains a transformative experience of realizing that cessation is possible, cessation of suffering is possible, one will want to strive to cultivate the various mental paths to achieve that. And that's the 4th noble truth, true paths. And it's at this point, when one comes to cultivating true paths, or engaging wholeheartedly in doing so, then in dependence on one's predisposition, one may choose to embark on cultivating the paths of individual liberation, the paths of hearers and solitary realizers. Or one may choose to engage in cultivating the paths of bodhisattvas, the paths of the Mahayana Dharma. And if one chooses to engage in cultivating the paths of the Mahayana Dharma, one will choose either the paths of the sutra teachings or the swift paths of the tantric teachings. So therefore, whichever, in dependence on one's predisposition, whether one chooses or is inclined to engage in the cultivation of the paths of the Theravada Dharma, the paths of individual liberation, or the Mahayana Dharma, whether the Mahayana Dharma of the sutra paths or the Mahayana Dharma of the Mahayana tantric paths, whichever of these one is inclined towards, that is preceded by an understanding that cessation is possible. That itself is preceded by an understanding that the origins, the causes of suffering can be abandoned, and that is preceded by an understanding of what the origins of suffering are, and that is preceded by a clear understanding of suffering itself. And this method of training is precisely in accordance with what Buddha Shakyamuni taught, And Buddha Shakyamuni taught precisely in accordance with how he himself trained. So he presented the complete and unmistaken path that he himself had followed. And all subsequent beings who have achieved enlightenment, and those before Buddha Shakyamuni who did too, have trained in this self-same way.
Dadele yang chik shimju che de kabla cheba chidu kala dangbo ane chik rakbaru dangbo rakbar cheba chidu kasan nganzu gi shengyu shi na sheba tokpa de chago re dele ya ship chabu ya ship char sa cheba samdang de de cheba chidu kabla cheba chago ro chesang kasan tokpa de cheba sa da dirwa tokje ni se de dinade nyamle che li gore 당아 저 아직 녀마 되니기 주주 오다 노트 임바데 녀마 디버 제와데 베 노샤 선베게 다디 디버 제나 샤르 뇌베 삼바 컨트롤다 되차다 녀모바게 디베 노르도와 되네 노멀에 되네 아주 강아 찌기도 왔선베게 교바게야데 네 교바게 가상아 저 교바샤나 교바나리 용으로
In dependence on your endeavors over the last maybe couple of years to understand this text, take that knowledge and apply it to our spiritual development. Because when we started out, when we spoke about direct perception, it was seen that direct perception is where the mind really is altered, where we directly realize, gain direct realization of the object of meditation. And this is preceded by an inferential valid cognition, also a truly transformative realization, which is based on reasoning. So in order to attain a direct perception of, for example, selflessness, it is preceded by an inferential valid cognition. Both of these come about in dependence on two of the four changeable mental factors we looked at last night, investigation and analysis. These two mental factors are of great importance. We need to utilize them, always relying on reasons so as to lead to deeper, more sustained transformation of our way of thinking. And a third changeable mental factor we looked at last night, that of regret. This too we should cultivate. Regret for non-virtue that we have engaged in. Because in dependence on cultivating regret for non-virtue through understanding the suffering results that will follow, we will turn ever more away from non-virtue, making it easier for our mind to be in the direction of virtue, and thereby speeding our spiritual development.
다 되네야 디 곰제 안 제바 체마디 바 곰 다메도 별로도 곰메도 되고 당보 제바디 되네 이바세 제시고 계지 이바 숨바 차도 제시 차로고 되네 마지다 고 띵에 좀 줍시네 줍 안델야 곰곰오지도 강점 질야 안 다메바 토픽에 제시 제바게 제수 중에 제시디 다음에 보고 무슨 또비기 참아차도 무슨 또도 파비고 봐도도 다음에 보고 무슨 또도 제가 대시 다음에 또비 제바 참아도 봐 규제시 용어죠 대야 유유제 간점질이야 통로 용어 토용도 다음에도 무슨 참아 오차고 제가 다디 양아지 대인가서 참아 나는 무슨 참아자 당 참아자 다도 신다고 다고 무슨 참아 그디나 무슨 참아 내마도다 그 또가 규야마 되는 야야야 저 산지고 봐 규례게 무슨 참아 자르고 마도 무슨 참아 규야마 다 당보데 또보데 또바 참아래 제바 참아래 니바 규르진에 제시샤 제시용어요 대야야 곰곰곰 가지고 된동 다음에 봐도 무슨 용어고 규고 다 체면 안에 약속되다 무슨 참아 제거 다음에 제바되게 똑바 인장 걸로 교인 가려서는 그 된진난 거래 관지 된진나디 거래 세상 교인지 됐어요래 이제 교인 예대 봐서 장마장냐 차고 말 유디 도어래 당 무슨 용어 주요도 장마장냐 차고래 유디 진마 지신 통통 거래
when we started out looking at the sevenfold division of awareness and knowers, we started by looking at direct perception. These are some that we, such as sense direct perceivers, we already have, but in particular, one is striving to develop the most profound realization, which is a yogic direct perception. So I think this was back on page 6. So this is what one is ideally looking to eventually cultivate, but merely having an aspiration to achieve a yogic direct perception of emptiness is insufficient. One has to train one's mind through engaging in a specific sequence. So first, one hears teachings, and whilst hearing them, reflects on them, utilizing in particular these mental factors of investigation and analysis. And through engaging in this process repeatedly over a sustained period, one's correct understanding of reality will grow and develop. And eventually, one will come to the point where one will attain an inferential valid cognizer. So an inferential valid cognizer is a powerful transformative realization based on reasoning, where one comes to realize the object, such as emptiness. However, an inferential valid cognition is, which I think was at page 8 or 9, or 10 maybe, an inferential valid cognition, though still has one fault, which a direct perception does not. The inferential valid cognition, whilst realizing its object based on reasoning, also realize it via a meaning generality or a mental image of the object. Therefore, the object, say, of emptiness, isn't directly perceived, but is realized via a meaning generality. So therefore, emptiness, or the object, doesn't appear clearly because it's realized via a meaning generality. So when one does gain this transformative realization of an inferential valid cognizer, one continues repeatedly to engage in this meditation, deepening one's realization ever more, and each subsequent realization here is a subsequent cognizer, another of the sevenfold division of awareness and knowers. Eventually, through repeated familiarity with now the subsequent cognizer, one comes to a direct realization. And that direct realization, because of what the object is called a yogic direct perception. And a yogic direct perception, when a yogic direct perception of emptiness is attained, one becomes an Arya being. One attains the path of seeing, becomes an Arya being. And here, one's realization of emptiness is entirely non-conceptual. And here one has attained a deep and profound realization of emptiness. And as one continues, and now from this point, continuing right up through the achievement of Buddhahood, one's realization of emptiness will remain non-conceptual.
Alright, da nganzo din ma xiar le ya, ni ji xue, da din ya ji Lorig gi nam xia cha sa ba chi cha ba re. Da din ma xiar de le ani de dumdi gi de su mi da wa de kya ba yo re je re. Ne xiar la dumdi de su ni se da. Da de le ya mi da kya ba khar yo ras ne, be ne jera ma wa da uma ba le de de ji uma ran ju ba se da. Jera ma wa che, de de ji uma ran ju ba che, ten ju ba che, kon so sum ji gi 가르디고르스네 체마리아 원병고스미 체마 이용고스미 체마 가서 원병고스미 이용고스미 나중고스미 체네 원스미래 숨 제거마다 라링고스미 킬링고 말이지 제라마와게 라링고스미 킬링고 말에 라릭세데 킬링고 말에 되되지부 우마란유비게 라릭 킬링고 말에 땡규비 라릭 킬링고 말에 케밀렌 바자 콘종고스미들 라링고스미 자요 말에 라리 코랑 케밀렌 바자 디네 자네 참마들 원숨들라 가르쳐도 원병 원숨샤다 이용원숨 내중원숨 숨도 장해 봐 되바래 마도 안딜에 하요 말이죠 인비김자 가르자 데남게 라리 원숨 미디비 치르스 라리 킬링고 말이죠.
So through the presentation of the text, on a number of occasions, it's been mentioned that the different Buddhist philosophical schools don't present Buddhist psychology in exactly the same way. There are differences amongst Buddhists. And this now is presented in summary form in the auxiliary on page 25. So starting at the top. Vaibhashikas, Sautrantika, Svatrantika Madhyamikas, and the Prasangika Madhyamikas, they assert that direct valid cognizers are limited to 3 because they do not assert self-knowing direct perceivers. The 3 are sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, yogic direct perceivers. So the reason why Vaibhashikas, Sautrantika, Svatrantika Madhyamikas, and Prasangika Madhyamikas, they don't assert self-knowing direct perceivers is because they don't assert self-knowers at all. So if they assert that the consciousness that performs a function of self-knower does not exist, they do not assert a self-knower, and therefore they do not assert a self-knowing direct perceiver. So when they divide direct perceivers, they divide them just into 3.
Dodejibu Umaranjuba, the Najujibu Umaranjuba says, Yichagurva, Chisnada, Dodejibu Umaranjuba said, that Benelobilatenji, the Dodejibu Umaranjuba, conjugate the killing Gomer. Chisnada Umaranjuba and the Cho Jigi, Lobishiwas also be Raji killing Gode, then Lobilatenja also about Dodejibu Umaranjuba, Tisugi, Raji said the killing Gomarvada. Then also Raji Kimilin Bashagorva.
So I don't believe we've discussed the in this text the division of the Svatrantika Madhyamika into 2. This, as we've seen here, Svatrantika Madhyamika, and there's also a division just below, Yogacharya Svatrantika Madhyamika. So the middle way school, the Madhyamika school, is divided into 2, Svatrantika and Prasangika. The Svatrantika Madhyamika itself is divided into 2. The Sautrantika, Svatrantika Madhyamika, who, as we see here, do not assert self-knowers, and they are best known by the Pandit Bhavavaveka. And then the second division of Svatrantika Madhyamika, the Yogacharya Svatrantika Madhyamikas, who do assert self-knowers, they are best known by the Pandit Shanktarakshita.
I didn't know all the Rarike, Monsum killing in the letter, Dodebache, Semsambache, Najujubu, Umaranjuba, Namji, Monsum Yetsemala, Wambu Monsum, Gasa, Wambu Monsum, Yi Monsum, Radik Monsum, Naju Monsum, Dashir Jange Partu, so that is a Semsam Dodebache, Semsambache, and Najuju Umaranjubache, and Dodeba, Semsamba, Naju Umaranjuba. Disum digi and the Karakiling or Sene, Monsum the she killing or Wabi Monsum, Yi Monsum, Ranjing Monsum, that you Monsum Sene, she killing or conjugate Randy killing or Regime.
The text continues. Sautrantikas, Chittamatrans, and Yogacharya Svatrantika Madhyamikas assert direct valid cognizers as being limited to 4. Sense direct perceivers, mental direct perceivers, self-knowing direct perceivers, and yogic direct perceivers. So here we can see that these Buddhist philosophical schools, they do assert self-knowers, whereas the previous grouping do not.
Dodebi lamna ngosum dikelia matua sheva in kores matua guneo mares or ngosumla tua guneo marechire na semzambi galosne ngosumla tua yungures jeza matua kyanya mares or dadini kyaba chigorda semzambi ngosumla tua yores matua kyanya mares dene dodebi ngosum dela matua mado ani tua yo mares achi.
And the next part presents a difference between the Sautrantika and the Chittamatra schools. So a key difference between them is that for the Sautrantika, direct perception is pervaded by being unmistaken. All direct perceivers are unmistaken. Chittamatra, they assert that direct perception is not pervaded by being unmistaken. Direct perception can be mistaken. So that's the key difference. Chittamatrans say that direct perception can be mistaken, whereas Sautrantika say no, all direct perceivers are unmistaken.
가르쳐버려 람나 베네 디시오레 아 저기 추동 유기 원배 셰발이야 숙되게 나도 숙되게 치료되는 주변난 거래저와 제선다 샘점비 치료되는 주변 켈링교 말와 케멜렌 바인자 왕셰를 수 나도 치료되는 주변난 거래서 지산 치료 주변 던 주변 나와 나신 치료되는 주변 요 말와 매바인자 수동 유기 숙소 나위기 셰바 원숨되게 추셔리에서 그래서 그 치료되는 주변난 거래서 나와 나신 치료되는 주변 요 말에서 제산 그 추셔리에서 이거래 너데 비게 갈라고서는 디 추시에 말에 치료된 주바 요래라고 혼나와난 치료된 주바 요되래 인자 추요 말했어 진짜 디 너나디로 거기 개발 가서는 치료된 주바 케일메레 투송어려 너데 비게 치료된 주바 나와 나시 치료된 주바 레스 진짜 너요 말했어 다 샘잔 비게 치료된 주바 나와 나시 치료된 주바 말했어 진짜 디 너래요 진짜 추시래서 디시고래 이 권익이다 추시에 인민게 개발로 시디래.
So that's then the difference between Sautrantika and Chittamatra. So why do they have this difference? Why do Sautrantika say that direct perceivers are necessarily unmistaken, whereas Chittamatrans say they can be mistaken? They are both mistaken and unmistaken. And this is because specifically in the context of sense direct perceivers. So a sense direct perceiver, perhaps a visual sense direct perceiver seeing an object or hearing an object. Here, the object appears to be externally established. If we take an illustration of form that is perceived, this appears to exist as an external object. So there, Sautrantika and Chittamatra don't disagree. Where they disagree, so they don't disagree that form, for example, appears to exist as an external object. Their disagreement comes as to whether it does or not. Sautrantika say form does exist as an external object, therefore the sense direct perceiver that perceives it as existing externally is unmistaken. And it's unmistaken because that is how the object exists. Chittamatra say form does not exist as an external object. Form does not exist as an external object. That's the difference. And because form does not exist as an external object, the sense direct perceiver to whom form appears as existing externally is mistaken, because the object appears in a way that it doesn't exist as external, and that is mistaken. So the difference then between Chittamatra and Sautrantika is that Sautrantika assert that form exists as an external object. Chittamatrans say form does not exist as an external object. And therefore, the consciousness, the sense direct perception to which form appears, Sautrantika say are unmistaken because form appears in the way that it exists. Chittamatrans say that sense direct perception is mistaken because the form appears in a way that it does not exist. And with this dispute between the Sautrantika and Chittamatra, the Svatrantika Madhyamaka, the autonomous middle way schools, they agree with the Chittamatrans. They say that a form does not exist as an external object. So the Svatrantika agree with the assertion of the Chittamatrans.
제라마와던 되대 바세게 치료 된도 주바 켈레 치료 된도 주바 삼다나디다 텐주비게 치료 된도 주바 삼다나이나 삼다나 카가레 나 치료 된도 주바 세디 제라마와 도데바 셈잠바 우마랑주바 혼수 치료 된도 주바 주탄 집바 차고래 주탄으로 집바 지나 줍타디 제라마와던 되대 바디게 치료 된도 주바 줍타디 다 셈잠베기 디요 말레라 거래 치 된데 줍나 결혼 라바나 요고 그러데 이나 결혼 라바나 요요 말레라 거래 자 치료 된도 줍나 제라마와도 되데바 결혼 쪽이 라바나 신직 두고고레스 이나 결혼 쪽 라바나 신 디주야요 말레라 거래 제라 그래서 셈잠바다 우마라주버기 나 베데 치료 된도 줍아셔야 돼 장주 제라마와다 도데바 치료 된도 줍아레스 거봐 다 제라 우마셈잠바다 아니 우마라주버 치료 된도 마주바레라로봐 다 치료 된도 줍나 간에서 주부레스 줍타지요로봐 줍타디 셈잠바다 가사 도데바다 제라마 줍타디 지바레스 제사디 제라마와다 도데바 요레라고 셈잠베다 우마라주비기 줍타디 나신주 주야요 말레스 줍나디네 줍고고레데 이나 디네 주야요 말레라고 그래 Thank you because you do the Kahares. In a Kahares, Jordan Kahare.
So the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, they assert that phenomena are externally established. Chittamatra and Svatrantika do not accept that phenomena are externally established. Prasangika, so that we've heard thus far. Prasangika, they do say that phenomena are externally established. However, the way that phenomena are externally established is not correct. The way that Prasangika then will say to the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantikas, whilst we agree with you in terms of, yes, external objects, a form is externally established, the way that you say that phenomena is externally established is mistaken. So Prasangika, so just repeat that. Chittamatra and Svatrantika say that external phenomena are not externally established. Vaibhashika, Sautrantika say that they are externally established, as do Prasangika. But Prasangika say, you Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas, the way you believe that external phenomena exist is mistaken. So your mode of establishment, your way that you say phenomena are established, that is wrong.
제라마와단 되데바디기 치료드는 제라마와단 되데바단다 셈잠바 우마랑주바디기 치료드는 줍나 간스 두부레라비 제라마와 되데베기 치료드는 줍나 가르시워스네 düten tamoshi uji düten jemese juares da be düten na chushu dile chung da me diken chachuye che me diken düten chungshu juares düten chame denegi düten digi pa ngado suk dubu kanes dubu oresne dene düten digi pa jikdom ni dom du chen sa ne dene zu chen dene rakba dubu ores 제사 dene düten ngado 통고 ores 제사 düten denegi 주야 될 치료 되는 주바세 월 치료 되는 주바 düten 당보 자위 규디 düten 참에 차체 여기네 매 누를 참으시고 지제 대소파 루루루제네 도도도도 첼첼샤가 간제 리라와다 강김라서 같은 주가 되는 간제 통고하레스 지제 디치로 된도 주다데서 디 제라마와도 되베 지나다 셈잠바 제라바도 되베 디치로 된도 주탄 디순고래 지나다 셈잠바다 우마라죠 바게 가르라고스네 데네기 주탄도 요 말해서 düten 차균에 제 메팅 düten 기네 요 말해서 düten 가데 좋나 차체야 요레스 제산 차체야 기메 düte 요 말해서 데네기 데네 예제 주바이나 결혼하셔봐도 된바레스 이내야 düten 차체야 메디긴 기네 체 메디긴 düten 요 말해서 제산 매반자 디사제도 도도 차스라요 말해서 제산 düten 참에스 사네 아니 라고 줍세야디 추리든 줍세야디 요 말해서 그래서 düten 참에 호로 요 말에 düten 충충충충 요르 이내 차체야 요레스 원래
So these first two schools, or the lower Buddhist philosophical schools of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, they assert that if you to break up an object into its particles, one can break up those particles into its smallest particles, and that into its very smallest particle. And there is a base particle that is self-existent, And when you take that tiniest particle and gather other particles together with it, eventually you'll get something larger, and that will be observable, that will be seen. So this is how phenomena exist. This is how external phenomena exist. There is a smallest existent particle, a particle that is self-existent. You gather many of these together, and you then have a form that can be observed. Chittamatra and Svatantika, two higher schools, they say, if what you said was correct, then this is how phenomena would be established, but there is no such tiniest particle that can be found. Because when one analyzes in meditation and comes to that smallest particle can be divided. It has parts. So therefore there is no smallest particle. Because whatever you believe is that smallest particle, it can be divided further into parts. And those parts can be further subdivided. Therefore, there is no smallest particle.
제수 차균의 체면은 투에 투인데 찍마도 작으면 와 찍차로 그래 바제로 그러와 제가 디니 차기로 와라도 권주 가서 차균의 체매 말에 인자 매와서 두스는 투그립에서 찍찍을 두고 말했어 두고 말해지래 그 투원에다 차균의 찍바 차로 차기로 와 제가 두고 말해라래 아니 마도나 디네 도도 차전 디니 간스 되게 람네 딜룽이 주고 와래서 룽 예, 룽귀지 곧 망고 소어도 찍두된 참매들이 찍찍을 두고 와마도 이나 차상도 루루제 되어야지 그렇게 룽귀지 진되고 그래서 그래서 디테시게 거래 룽룽 제가 뭐 너데밖에 갈라고 했으네 두된 참매 망고지 소어도 찍찍을 못하는 마사로 그러와 지사디 마사마저 디니 도도지 되어봐대 가르치 그랬으네 룽귀 가서 룽귀지 되고 그래 주고 그래서
Just to briefly correct an error that translator made in the previous segment. Again, I didn't refer to anything about a self-existent particle. That word self-existent, he didn't use. So that was my error. But what Vaibhashika and Sauchantika, the bottom two schools, they assert that there is a smallest particle that's findable, and that this particle is partless. Whereas the two higher schools, the Chittamatrans and Svatantika, say that is not the case. That smallest particle has parts. If you divide it, it will have parts. And they say that this is the case because if a particle has no parts, it has no directions. Sorry, it's a directionally partless particle. That's the full name. So if a partless particle would be directionless. And then the higher schools say, to the lower schools, how can something be directionless? There's no north or south, there's no top or bottom, left or right. So how can you stack particles together if you cannot put one above the other because they have no direction? So therefore, the Chittamatra and Svatantika refute the Vaibhashika and Sauchantika presentation that every object can be broken up into its parts and its particles, and it's to get to the smallest one, which is directionally partless particle. And the higher schools refute this by saying there's no such thing as a directionally partless particle, because if there were, one couldn't stack one thing on top of the other when something has no bottom or top. But the Vaibhashika and Sauchantika reply to this and say, no, you haven't understood our view correctly. Whilst these particles have no direction and no parts, they can be gathered together, and they're gathered together by energy or wind energy. And it's through wind energy that particles, despite having no direction or parts, can be gathered together and comprise form. So this is the basis for disagreement, and how the higher schools say to the lower schools, you're wrong, And how the lower schools reply to the higher schools, no, it's you that's wrong.
tenju bigi chiru dundu juba sayade dine shagyo mare. Tenju bigi chiru labyo de nang chiyo gore, nang chile due che chilo sha gore, mado nang ma due ba chilo sha mare. Nang sayade chiro chi due ne nang sha gore, nang la due ne chiro sha gore. 제자다 nang sayade nga zo sheba, yu dubi sheba de che. She nang sheba le shen bigi suk la soba di chiru yu suk la gore da. nang shebale shenpiki chiru yu suk de yela and chiru yu suk chiru dundu chuba la war chesa dine za de chiru bigi tenju bigi chiru dundu chuba scaling body nang sheba main bigi suk tra di ro la so chasa chiru dundu chuba yela war chiru dundu chuba kasa nang chiru dundu chuba chiru ngo ni chup de bare se de nang sheba main be sheba la ma de ba she kasa sheba main bigi ko yu su su chuba yin za chiru dundu chuba se de da tenju bigi chiru dundu chuba se chi da nang sam da nang se di sheba che de sheba mayin bi su de la chiru dundu chuba smi ta go re che za tenju bi sam da di re ne shi me
So that's the discussion between the two lower schools and the two above them. In the higher school, that of Prasangika, they have quite a different take on this. So they first make the point that what you're talking about is external objects or external form. And this is something separate from consciousness in that external phenomena refers to the form in the world, internal phenomena refers to consciousness. So they make this division firstly between consciousness and everything that is not consciousness. So that's everything external. And therefore they say that you can only talk about external phenomena in relation to internal phenomena. One can only have this discussion of form because of there being consciousness, of being able to talk about consciousness. So they make this relationship between you can only talk about external in relation to their being internal. So therefore you see the presentation of the Prasangika is quite apart, quite different from the others. So we'll stop there for this morning. We'll continue from here then this afternoon. And if you have some questions, then feel free to ask now. Then enjoy your lunch.